Okay, we're going to get started. Sorry about the late delay. I wanted to give people time to filter in, and we understood that there was some delays on the turnpike. So I want to welcome everybody to our third advisory committee meeting of the East-West Passenger Rail Study. My name is Ethan Britland. I'm with Mass DOT. I'm one of the project managers for the study. And I'm going to walk you through the first number of slides, and then I'm going to turn it over to our team. So this is our agenda for today. Again, we have a presentation lined up. We also have questions and answers afterwards. Clarifying questions only during, please try to limit them. We are going to focus on the advisory committee initially, and we understand there's a contingent of public. We will open it up at the end to questions and answers from the public. And so I'm just going to run through the agenda real quick. Again, we're going to go through welcome and introductions. Just welcomed everybody. We are going to go around the room on the advisory committee just so everyone knows who everyone is. I also want to point out who the team members are from the MassDOT side, and just because there's going to be more than just, there's probably going to be about 4 of us presenting, and I want to make sure everyone knows who everyone is. So I'm going to go over meeting objectives as well, just so everyone understands sort of what the purpose of this meeting is, but I'm also going to talk about the next advisory committee meeting, just so everyone understands the connection between the two. So while we're going through the presentation, they can have it in their mind of what the next advisory committee meeting holds. I will go over study overview, and then we'll jump into the corridor analysis. We are going to lead that with the development of alternatives as a refresher for everyone and for those in the public that hadn't seen it prior. And the sub-bullets there are the things that were the primary pieces of the analysis. We're not by any means complete with the analysis. This is part of the analysis we've done for the 6 alternatives that we had shown at the last advisory committee meeting. Again, our evaluation criteria are sort of primary metrics. Big one being ridership, and we're going to go over methodology. We have a team member here that can answer those questions on ridership, and the rest of the alternatives analysis, and then questions and discussion. And again, additional information and requests. I'm going to transition to this slide because that ties into that last bullet point. Again, our meeting objectives, we want to review the purpose of the study, purpose and goals. We have our key metrics for assessing our benefits and costs and impacts. And this last bottom half of the slide is sort of I want to pause here and talk about it in a little bit more detail. So again, the advisory committee is meant to advise us, obviously, but we want to hear feedback from the advisory committee members. So as we present, please keep in mind that we are looking for what kind of clarifications are needed about the information presented, but also is there additional information that we need for the next advisory committee meeting. We understand that there's a lot of information here. The purpose of the advisory committee is to be involved in what we're doing. So we want to show what we've done. We want to hear feedback. We also want to hear what we might want to provide more information on. And so our advisory committee meeting at the end of the month is meant for us to come back and give you information that we've looked into, but also we understand that you want time to look at the alternatives, digest them, and so this is an opportunity for the advisory committee meeting members to come back and ask more questions. That deviates a bit from our prior process approach. We had talked about coming to a next advisory committee meeting, narrowing it down to 3, but we've taken a step back and we've restructured our approach, understanding that this is it's obviously very important, but we want to be methodical about our study process, so we really want to hear from everyone. So I'm going to get into study overview. We've shown the slide before. The only update on it is roughly where the star sits, but also we've added another advisory committee meeting. Again, the one at the end of the month we've added just so we could come back and have more interaction with the advisory committee. So we went through our existing conditions, market analysis. This is our sort of due diligence on what's out there now. We really have to pivot off of that. We go through our alternatives development, which is what we showed at the last advisory committee meeting. And then where we are now today, we've done our most of the alternatives evaluation for what we call the preliminary 6 alternatives. Again, we had intended on going down to 3, and we still do intend on that. But we want to have more feedback from the advisory committee. So getting to that final 3 is going to take a little bit longer. We're going to go, obviously, to the next meeting. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then ultimately, we do have recommendations, and we wrap it into a final report. We are still shooting for, we say spring, but we are shooting for the end of May. But obviously, it depends on public process. And we've shown this one before, but this is the overarching slide of goals for our study. And we obviously want to provide better transportation options to and from Western Massachusetts. Clearly, we want to support economic development. And tying in to that, we want to improve the attractiveness in Western Mass for affordable housing. And obviously, if you get more rail ridership, you can hopefully take cars off the road, and then that ties into lowering greenhouse gas and air quality emissions. This is our study corridor, Boston to Pittsfield or Pittsfield to Boston. And the color coding there denotes that the MBTA service is between Boston and Worcester. And then you have Amtrak service from Boston to Pittsfield and beyond, but this is just showing the distinction between the 2 different providers. Actually, and so this up at the top, and we understand there's the Lakeshore Limited, 27 went round trips on the Worcester line, and then there is a lot of freight service on the CSX line, which is Pittsfield to Worcester in this segment. Oops, sorry. And so this slide, again, is a slide we've shown before, but aside from sort of the infrastructural piece, demographic data is really what plays a big part of both our ridership analysis, but also just a big part of the study overall. And this is meant to obviously show the existing employment and population. This next slide is the change between 2020 and 2040. The 2040 piece is it's important because of long-range planning, but also it plays a big part of our ridership. And obviously, there's some varying levels of increases and decreases. And I think there's obviously the decreases show opportunities for, let's say, housing, increase in housing or population. And this is just a numerical and percent change for employment.
Quick question.
Yes, sorry.
Those 2 maps, it's incredibly hard to see what it's at. What's the general trend and takeaway that you're reflecting for us?
So the major urban centers, like obviously Boston, Springfield, and Pittsfield, are showing an increase for population, but they're showing a bit of a decrease for employment, from what I recall. And so, yeah, so I think it's the employment side is we're viewing as an opportunity to, with better connectivity, we can look to hopefully improve that kind of demographic. This is a slide we've shown before. It's in existing conditions. So this is our physical constraints. As part of alternatives development and analysis, these are things that we have to keep in mind. That between Pittsfield and Springfield, there's a lot of ledge and right-of-way constraints. And there's a lot of grade crossings. Between Worcester and Springfield, there's a lot of curves in the line that presents problems for speeds. Between Springfield and Worcester, there's a lot of CSX freight usage, and there's a lot of vertical grades, as we know. And we have, heading further east, there's a lot of grade crossings in Framingham. Specifically in downtown, there's an at-grade rail crossing that it presents problems for downtown area Framingham. And then we obviously have long-term constraints at South Station, and we'll get into that in a little bit in a later slide. So study background. This is more meant in, as we call it, the planning context. This is really meant to highlight that this isn't the first time we're looking at this corridor. As part of the Massachusetts State Rail Plan, we recommended further east-west study. NERI, which Northern New England Intercity Rail Initiative, that looked at Boston to, it was called the Inland Route, so it was Boston to New York and south via Springfield, and it also looked Boston to Montreal via Springfield, so the overlapping piece being Boston to Springfield. And that study resulted in it was an EA, which is an environmental assessment, and a finding of no significant impact. Now, one thing to note about NERI was that while it's extremely similar to what we're doing here, the scope of work was narrowly defined to stay on the existing CSX line with some double tracking. So the speeds, as a result of that study, the speeds were still lower than what we're looking at here in our study. And Rail Vision, which looked at a number of options for enhancing the MBTA commuter rail system, which electrification was a major finding or recommendation of Rail Vision. And as part of our analysis, we have to understand what completed projects there are out there, and the Hartford line that's open and running, and 16 round trips between New Haven, Hartford, and Springfield, and a pretty healthy ridership for year one at 583,000. And Springfield Union Station, that has been open, but one of the final improvements was opened recently with a ribbon cutting, and that was a new full-length high-level platform, Platform C. And so these are what we call pending projects, but there are obviously things out there that are not funded that affect east-west service, and so these are the projects that we have assumed they would be in place for the purpose of analysis, but have not yet made it through either, let's say, environmental permitting or not yet funded, but they're in the process at some level. And that's Worcester Union Station, and that's, so right now it's feasibility design. It's funded in MassDOT's capital investment plan. That involves track upgrades and a center platform full accessible. And South Station expansion, that's to put in new tracks, new platforms, and that one did receive a grant recently for the Tower 1 interlocking. And Worcester triple tracking, that is third track on the Worcester commuter rail line, Framingham to Wellesley. That is a study underway, and that is funded under MassDOT's capital investment plan. And all of these investments tie into east-west passenger rail service. And again, for the purpose of analysis, they're assumed to be in place. This is a slide that shows sort of our alternatives development and analysis process. Obviously, we are here. And so we've gone through our high-level alternative screening. We've gone through preliminary alternatives of 6, and we're going to narrow it down. But again, as I prefaced earlier, we're going to step or tier bringing it down to 3. And before I transition to one of our team members, I'm realizing that I didn't go around the room for introductions. So thanks for nobody saying anything. So we have a microphone floating. So.
Oh.
Great. So if you could just start on one corner, or do you want to start at Ned, please?
I'm Ned Codd with the WSP project team.
Joel Anders, WSP project team.
Laura McQuethy with the project team.
Jeremy Thompson, 495 Metro West Partnership.
John Ajelski, Congressman McGovern's office.
Melissa Olson, Senator Markey's office.
Bill Hollister with Amtrak.
Dominic Sarno, City of Springfield.
Rick Sullivan, President, Western Mass Economic Development Council.
Elizabeth Quigley, Congressman Richard Neal's office.
Pat Carnevale, Governor's office.
Smitty Pignatelli, State Representative from the West East Caucus.
Tom Matusko from Berkshire Regional Planning Commission.
Ricardo Morales from the City of Pittsfield.
Jonathan Butler from One Berkshire.
Adam Hines, State Senator for the Berkshire, Hampshire, Franklin, Hamden District.
Lindsay Sabadosa, State Representative, 1st Hampshire District, Northampton area.
Eric Lesser, State Senator for the 1st Hamden and Hampshire District.
Nancy Creed, President of the Springfield Regional Chamber.
Janet Pierce, Executive Director, Central Mass Regional Planning Commission.
Darren Gray, Bay State Health Network.
Todd Bailey, Bay State Health.
Maureen Mullaney, Franklin Regional Council of Governments.
Linda Dunleavy, also from the Council of Governments.
Linda Leduc, the Town of Palmer.
Michaela Niles, MassDOT Planning.
Emily Kristen, Project Team.
And Drew Galloway with the project team and project manager. Nice to see you all again. Thank you, Ethan. I'm going to tee this up with just a few slides, and then we'll have some of my colleagues, Laura McWethy, to talk about the ridership in more detail, and my co-PM, Ned Codd, will talk a little bit more on the detail going into each alternative, and then we'll wrap it up again and try and summarize it all. So where we are, of the 6 alternatives, I'll start by saying we lumped them into 3 general categories. And the first one is a shared corridor. It's a CSX corridor, where the existing tracks and alignments and right-of-way that is in place is also shared. So essentially, if it's a single track, a double track goes in right next to it, consistent with actually the historic practices there, where it was all a double track railroad at one point in time. But there are some differences I'll get to as we go along on the engineering on it. The next category is shared corridor. It's in a general right-of-way, but a new passenger track is constructed in proximity to the existing freight tracks. And the guidance that has been used for other projects throughout the nation in similar situations like this is the track is roughly 25 to 30 feet away from the existing main freight tracks to meet a bunch of different criteria that have been established by the freight railroads and through their umbrella association, the Association of American Railroads. And it's a policy that's used somewhat uniformly throughout the country anymore to look at intercity corridor type projects of this nature. And the last category was a completely separate corridor from the railroad. It turned out not to be a completely separate corridor from everything else, and we paired it going down the alignment of I-90 for a number of different reasons. So we have these 3 categories, and within each of them, started to look at the characteristics that are associated with the service plan that gets developed and the nature of it and how it gets produced. Travel time, this is a group that is very focused on travel time, obviously, and the different components here influence travel time in many different ways. I've talked about the corridor types. When you have a shared corridor next to the track, you are limited from an engineering perspective in what you can do to the track design. For the passenger train, a separate track allows greater freedom and flexibility to get higher speeds. Curvature and grade. This is an area that you're in the Berkshire Mountains, and this corridor ascends 2 grades, whether you go eastbound or westbound, one west of Springfield and one east of Springfield, close to Worcester. It traverses 5 watersheds in between Pittsfield and Boston, with the Westfield and the Kabog rivers in particular, the corridors, for extended periods of time influencing the topography, influencing the geography and the geology that new rail infrastructure can be put into, and the type of alignments that can be created within that environment. Track infrastructure itself. It has to conform to federal safety standards, and so our design, even the concept design, would adhere to that. More importantly, as speeds progress, and typically as you see speeds over 100 miles an hour, it's a switch from wooden to concrete ties to get the type of stability and reliability that's necessary to sustain high speeds on a reasonable basis. There are different signal system installations that are required with each of those speed thresholds. We built all this into, admittedly, again, a concept level, but a concept level of engineering and capital costing associated with each alternative. Conflicts with other rail traffic? Well, there won't be any conflicts, but that would be nice to be able to say that. What we did was for each alternative in development of the service plans, fully integrate it with the MBTA service, understanding where the impacts could be, what the mitigations would be, either in adjusting the service at the T-runs or adjusting the service in the corridor, looking at it, and also documenting the CSX freight traffic. We have not gotten yet to a full level simulation and operations modeling of the corridor involving CSX traffic, but we've reached out and have the documentation on it. We have a pretty good sense of when the train traffic operates and when it flows. And in creating the service plans that we'll talk about, use that as guidance to try and set it up and tee it up so that we are up front trying to mitigate what potential conflicts could be out there. Stopping patterns have a large influence. And this is not rocket science. The more times you stop a train, the longer the travel time grows. And so creating that trade-off and that balance between trying to achieve very competitive travel times and then serving as many stations and locations as possible is always, it's never easy, and we've recognized that, but we've attempted to test in a variety of different patterns here those impacts and those conditions. At least one of these alternatives tests a rail-to-rail transfer, and 3 of them test a bus-to-rail transfer. There may be good operations and economic reasons for that. The trade-off is you're lengthening travel time, and so you have a penalty associated with the longer travel time. You also have a penalty associated with simply making a transfer. And depending on the type of rider, some in the profile are more tolerant of a transfer than others, and some in particular on business travel are very, do not tolerate it very well. And frequency. We've drawn from other corridors. We'll talk about that later in our presentation, and we have some case studies that we can look at and draw from that in terms of frequencies. We have a range. We did this on purpose to test a range of different frequencies and a range of different capital costs and operating costs to try and get an understanding of the relationship between those attributes and the response in ridership and revenue. I can show you, and actually we can go out to Springfield Union Station, a frequency of 1 round trip a day that is generally considered pretty successful, and that's the Vermonter between St. Albans, Vermont and Washington, D.C., and that one train carries over 100,000 trips a year typically. People normally think of a corridor with greater flexibility, and so our range has gone from a minimum of 6 round trips up to 17 round trips, again, to try and get that range and understand how the ridership would respond. That was not the idea. I think that was the wrong button. Which one? There we go. I'm sorry. This gets to the meat of our process. And we actually, Ethan has referred to this as how do you make the sausage. This was essentially, we undertook this analysis and this structured process for each of the 6 alternatives and looked at more in it. So on the left side, our tasks, our efforts in documenting and gathering data and understanding from a concept engineering perspective what the physical conditions are and the development of a physical alignment and its associated engineering standards that go with it to be able to look at what the maximum speed is and what the typical capacity of an alignment of that nature would be. And that gets blended with the performance of the train itself, the vehicle itself. It's a big difference between a diesel and an electric for a locomotive. So understanding the characteristics of the vehicle itself and bringing that together into the alignment analysis gives you a configuration, which is the number of tracks and where sidings may be and junction points that are out there, and the profile that a train could typically operate over that given configuration and alignment. And again, it varied by each alternative, and it varied by the investment that we modeled and tested for each of those alternatives. The next step in this process was to take that information, get that understanding of the alignment and configuration, and build a service plan. It's like building a building. You really start with a foundation and you work your way into the different components. And you put it in there with an understanding, even before ridership modeling is completed, but an understanding in what that market is. Is it a very high profile on the commuter side? Does it have a lot of business travel? Does it have a lot of recreational travel? And each of those characteristics can influence and affect how the service performs and how well it does in providing a ridership component. So we did that. We drew from the previous examples I talked about, drew from understanding the demographic analysis that Ethan provided earlier, and started to create a market sense of how the service would come about. For each of these, although we varied frequency, we worked pretty hard to have a full scale of service over the course of the day. So each of these alternatives operates for between 16 and 22 hours, I think, was the longest case. So it gave some flexibility and some travel options across the board in looking at all those different markets. When we're done with this, we have a service plan that involves train schedules itself. It understands how much equipment is involved, how many train sets, how many locomotives, how many cars, what the labor implications are for actually running the train and maintaining the train. And that goes into the formation of the capital documents and the operating costs that come forward. And that's what we've gone through and have had our initial cuts at doing the ridership modeling. And Laura will talk about that shortly. We've put together estimates on what the capital needs will be and what the operating needs will be. And we've gone through and made an estimate on the impacts from a community perspective, from an environmental perspective, understanding where there may be changes in infrastructure and what that means in terms of community impacts. And that can include, this is not a NEPA study, but an understanding of noise impacts, an understanding of how that could influence operations and expanded operations at grade crossings, which Ethan, you talked about at Framingham. So we're at the point where we've captured some of that. We're moving to the point of doing the benefits cost analysis, and as Ethan said, we want your feedback and your guidance on that to try and complete that process. We also listen to a lot of feedback, and it runs the range of more trains immediately to more faster trains immediately to more trains. It's sort of you would expect that from a group and public that's very interested in seeing service expansions. There were some very good comments, and we did our best to take that into account and listen to it in the formation of these alternatives. We started this is stepping back just a little bit, but we went beyond just the 6 alternatives and looked at a very broad range, including alternative technologies, to get an understanding of what their influence would be and their potential impacts on the service before we got down to the 6 that we talked about. And these are the 6. Again, they progress from the lowest cost from an operations perspective and the lowest cost from a capital investment perspective to the other end, which is alternative 6, which goes down the Mass Pike and has a lot of frequency and also has a very large capital cost to create something of that nature. Alternative 1 is a shuttle. It simply runs between Springfield and connects to T trains at Worcester. We timed it in such a way that we thought it would provide service over the course of the day, but it involves a transfer. And it also involved a bus transfer either at Springfield or at Worcester. And so that was you can see the results because of those effects in the ridership modeling. And it had the lowest, not surprisingly, of all of them. And we'll talk about that more as we go along. Alternative 2 was sort of the opposite, which was to look at extending MBTA trains out to Springfield. And so we took a complement of trains and did so to understand how that would fit from an infrastructure perspective within Worcester to Boston, but also in types of service it would offer out to Springfield. One of the things we did conclude in that is it creates, in some respects, an equipment challenge, because the T trains tend to be long. They're 7, 8 cars long, and so you're extending big trains out to Springfield, and replacing them, that required more capital in terms of equipment replacement than the rest of the alternatives, where we chose a standardized 4-car train to understand how it worked. One of the reasons for looking at a train of that length is many of the freight carriers, including CSX, require a minimum number of axles in the train, and that's to make sure that the signal system functions properly. So including what is a reasonable level to comply with that is something we pursued in that respect. Alternative 3 is with new equipment entirely, and was also drawing from the NERI study that looked at higher speeds within the shared corridor, shared track environment. And so you'll see in this, as we go through it, that the travel times are reducing quite significantly, frankly, between 2 and 3 because of that. Alternative 4 is an entirely new corridor, new track, between Worcester and Springfield, and then it shared the track out to Pittsfield. The reason we did that, it gets back to the topography and the challenges of getting into the mountains area with some very narrow areas made it virtually impossible to actually think about a completely separate track. And so it has to be a shared track environment in that west of Springfield. Alternative 5 was envisioned only between Springfield and Boston with a separate track. This was our attempt to really understand what the shortest travel time could be. So it includes a series of high-speed bypass tracks where some of the worst curvature in the existing alignment takes place. For both 4 and 5, although it's a new track, we limited it to just a single high-speed track, and then looked at including 3 passing sidings. So that was incorporated into the service plan and the service analysis, and we did not look at trying to cost a complete double-track railroad all the way out, given the frequencies that we've tested. And as I said, the more you add, the more it tends to cost. That's understood, and also you get more ridership, and you get more revenue to help offset that. One thing I will note, this is a relatively long corridor in some respects. It's not the longest by any means in the nation, but if you boarded a Downeaster train at North Station and traveled on it, you would have to go about 7 to 10 miles beyond its terminus at Brunswick, Maine today to actually cover the same distance between Boston and Pittsfield. If you boarded a train at Springfield here and traveled to New York, you would go to Metro Park, New Jersey to cover the equivalent distance. I'm bringing that up is that has a big influence on the capital needs, particularly on the equipment side and the operating costs, where because of the length of the corridor, the equipment utilization is such that you can get a round trip out of a train crew, which is subject to hours of service requirements, and in many respects, just with the equipment. That was one of the reasons, frankly, for testing Alternative 5. Because of the shorter distance, it had the opportunity to get better equipment utilization out of it. And with that point, we're going to switch over to a little more of the alternatives analysis. And Laura, you can come up while we talk about a slide that Ethan had up there. This is the criteria in looking at ridership, in looking at physical impacts and the environmental impacts that are out there. And then we'll get to the capital costs and tee up a little bit about the benefit side. So the first thing we'll go into a deeper dive is on the ridership side. And you press the right button, not the top button. Okay. That's what I learned.
Thank you. So as Drew said, we're going to now talk a little bit more about what is going into these ridership forecasts. Before we actually start discussing the numbers, I just want to give you a little bit more of a detail about how we came up with them and what our methodology was. So here is just kind of a brief overview of how our model works. This is an incremental ridership model, which means it only looks at rail ridership. It takes existing rail ridership, factors it based on looking at our current demographics and our future year demographics of population, employment, and income, as well as really looking at the rail service we are proposing, which Drew mentioned several of these things, what is the travel time between stations, how frequently is the train running, what is the time of the previous train or the next train. Are we looking at rail versus bus, because those have a different impact on how many people will be riding it, and whether or not we are able to have a one-seat ride versus a connection. This model is the same model that we used for the NERI forecasting, so it has a consistency there across the corridors. And so one other thing I do want to point out on this that plays a role into how our forecasting is done is, I mentioned this is based on existing ridership. And so we are not looking at drastic changes. We're not going to, cut the time by 75% and increase it by 300% frequency. Instead, we're kind of looking at more incremental changes here, but the model is able to account for that by saying, oh, but we do know what we are actually proposing. There are certain instances in our corridor where we don't have base ridership, or we are looking to improve the ridership, the service offered, for example, Boston to Springfield. And so in that case, what we do is we say, here is a base ridership for a station pair that is not the station pair we're talking about, but it's similar enough that we can then use that as a starting point for that ridership. So I just want to talk a little bit more about how we do that, because that is a key component of where these ridership numbers are coming from. And so we want to make sure that we are starting with a correct number that we can then factor up and down. Similarly to how the inputs that go in directly to the forecast, the demographics and the service, we use those same things to pick a similar station pair. And in terms of importance, we really care about the service characteristics. We don't want to pick a base ridership station pair that has, again, 30 trains per day when we're only looking at 6 trains per day for our new service pattern. Or we don't want to look at a pair that is only 20 miles apart when we are trying to forecast 100 miles apart. As well as we don't want to look at station pairs that have dramatically different populations or employment. So Boston, for example, is kind of an outlier in this study area in terms of its population. So we had to kind of try and pick larger station pairs to mimic what that might be. I do want to point out, though, the proxy station pairs have to be within our study corridor for the model to work properly. So there are some limiting factors in how many station pairs we have available to be a proxy station pair. So therefore, we want to try and get a similar pair, but it's never going to be exactly perfect. And we just kind of try and mimic those as best as we can. One other thing I did want to mention back about the service that we're testing. The model looks at, as I mentioned, the service timetable, travel times, frequencies, transfers, et cetera, but it does not include fare as a direct model input. How that comes into play is it basically assumes the base ridership is there, assuming a certain fare, what people currently are paying. And so we want, when we pick our proxy station pair, we also don't want to say, okay, we're going to pick a really expensive fare pair for something that we wouldn't, this service maybe would be more commuter focused and would have a lower fare. So that was another consideration when we're looking at these proxy station pairs, is we want to make sure we're trying to get at what that might be. So for this purpose, we picked 2 primary proxy station pairs of Springfield to Hartford and Springfield to Wallingford to kind of be our large station pair and our smaller station pair. And the reason why we looked at the Hartford line ridership in particular was, again, due to we were anticipating this east-west line opening up much more of a commuter type focus. And so we want to get at those similar types of folks who would be riding the train and their sensitivities to things like fare and so forth. Another thing with this model that I do want to mention as well is we are not explicitly modeling trip purpose. This is just a single, we're pivoting off of existing ridership, and we don't know offhand what that trip purpose split would be. So that's another kind of implicitly baked into the model assumption that we don't want to get too far off of in terms of where we're getting our base ridership from. So next, I want to talk a little bit about what we're actually spitting out of this model, what we're including and what we're not including, and what could be potential for additional ridership on top of our forecasts. So what the model outputs is annual bidirectional ridership by station pair. This is, again, like I said, estimated using existing ridership, demographic changes, and service changes. A couple things that we are not including in here is induced demand based on shifting land use patterns. We were given a demographic forecast that we went with, and that does not assume that because we are opening up a faster travel time and better commuting options, that people would not perhaps shift where they are living. That is not something that we're baking in here. The other piece of induced demand that could be a pretty important thing for this is we are, some of our higher speed, faster trains that we have more frequent service, that could be actually transforming our transportation network as a whole. As people are shifting to rail, that's freeing up highway capacity and causing people to travel who would not currently be traveling unless this was an option out there, whether they're traveling by car or by train. So induced demand is a component that is frequently part of a rail ridership forecast. And we are not going to be showing that today in these numbers, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a range of what we've seen in other places as to what could be potential for induced demand. Rural markets, kind of on the western end of the corridor, they could see up to maybe a 5% increase in that ridership, and all the way up until true high-speed rail projects in urban areas, they can see up to 20 to 30% on top of their base forecast. So here are just a few examples, primarily European examples. These are actual induced demand numbers. Most of these systems were put in place, I believe, in like the 90s or so, but they're ranging, 20 to 30%. You can see that they actually saw in terms of their induced demand. The bottom two are some smaller induced demand numbers there. That is for the NEC Future Study. So these are forecasted numbers based on a 2013 survey that was done in the Northeast Corridor. And so that found that within the entire study area, which did include a lot of rural areas, there was about, I think, 2 to 3% induced demand with the preferred alternative for NEC Future, which was a high-speed, not true high-speed, but it was a high-frequency study. And then when we broke it down to just urban areas, we were able to see up to about 10% induced demand there. So as I mentioned before, our model does not explicitly say who will be traveling on this train, what is their trip purpose, where they go, what are they going shopping, are they commuting, and so forth. But we were able to look at some existing data and come up with some kind of profiles of who we think might be traveling this service, and that can range, again, over the higher frequency, faster travel time, to lower frequency, slower alternatives. We see about 10% of people would be regular commuters there. That would be in Western Massachusetts, commuting into Boston or Worcester, and that would be daily or near daily. The business travelers are a large chunk of that, and those could include people who would travel maybe not every day, maybe once a week or whatnot, or traveling to a business meeting, and so forth. That number would be about a quarter of our riders. And then as well as the largest chunk, which is typical of rail ridership of this type, would be personal travels. So going shopping, tourism, students, and so forth. One of the things I wanted to mention about the induced demand, a lot of the European examples, they attribute a lot of that induced demand to tourism. So because it's a novelty to travel on the high-speed rail, and it gets them into several very high tourism areas. So that could be a potential draw here as well. And then I also will say that commuters number, that percentage could increase. The more we are able to connect further markets to Eastern Massachusetts. So I think that's the ridership methodology, and I'll hand it over to Ned to talk a little bit more about the alternatives themselves.
Thanks very much. And this is just a review of the slide that Drew spoke to, kind of the end of the alternatives development process, and just wanted to do a quick review before we launch into the discussion of the detailed results of the alternatives analysis. Again, we're going to be looking at 6 alternatives. The first 3 are upgraded rail along the existing CSX rail alignment. The next 2, alternatives 4 and 5, are looking at a new rail alignment principally within the CSX property, offset from the existing rail alignment. And the final one is a new rail alignment in a totally separate corridor in the principally in the I-90 alignment because it is much straighter and has more space than the CSX rail corridor. And again, for the most part, the benefits increase as we progress through these alternatives. The costs increase as well.
Just apologies for jumping in. Just wanted to be clear that we understand that the future no-build conditions data was based on the long-range planning from the metropolitan planning organizations. All those demographic projections do not assume any kind of increased rail service above the Lakeshore Limited. So that was the sort of the takeaway of the conversation about the modeling used future demographic data from the federal planning process that we follow. But we recognize that from the induced demand, there would be changes, but our model did not assume those changes. So I just wanted to say before Ned continues into the alternatives analysis, we understand that, and part of the process here is to take feedback, and we understand that there's going to have to be some sensitivity analysis of what that those land use changes, population, demographic data changes could be. So when we get to the end, I just wanted to say that we're going to be talking about that, but I also wanted, as we're going through this, people to understand, the advisory committee and the public to understand that we are open to sensitivity analysis, understanding that that induced demand effect will be there.
Good. Thanks, Ethan. So this is alternative 1, and before we talk about the characteristics of the alternative and the results, I just wanted to orient people to help them navigate these diagrams because it can be very confusing, and there's a lot of information kind of embedded in the diagram. These are based on the alternatives diagrams that we developed for as we developed the alternatives. But just as a review, the corridor that you see for the first 5 alternatives, that is the existing CSX rail corridor. The black lines show the existing rail corridor where it is single-tracked, where it is double-tracked or more. The orange line, that is the new east-west rail service. The dashed green line is connecting bus service. The yellow line that's superimposed upon the rail shows where we are restoring double track where it's currently single tracked. The red line that goes along near the rail corridor shows new segments of rail alignment, and the blue and green dots are the rail stations, and those circles are proportional to the ridership, to the number of boardings. The blue area is direct boardings, people getting on. That's their first, step onto a train at that location. And the green is they are transferring from a different rail service. So alternative one is kind of the minimum build. This provides east-west rail service between Springfield and Worcester with service at Palmer. It is supported by a bus connection from Pittsfield to Springfield and on to Worcester. It requires a transfer to an MBTA train at Worcester. And just a couple of other items of the diagram, the little, what we call the snake at the bottom, the color-coded diagram of the rail line shows the speeds that are achieved based on geometry and scheduling of the rail service. And the little cross in the bottom right-hand corner shows the station services. The orange is direct east-west rail service. Green is supporting bus service. Yellow is connections from a connecting rail service like the Hartford line or the Vermonter on the Knowledge Corridor. Yes. Yeah. And Worcester is a big square with the train? I'm sorry, do other folks not have the circles? Huh, okay, well, my apologies. You should have gotten the circles. We will make those available. But does a big square equal a big circle? I do not believe the squares were proportional to the circles. So that, I guess, that was a layer that I apologize did not get turned on for the handouts. Yes. Yes. Well, and we'll actually we'll get specific numbers on that in just the next couple of slides. So, and this diagram shows the people. The circles show how many people are boarding, and this diagram shows what connections they're making. So the thickness of these lines is proportional to the two-way flow of passengers between those stations. So you can see here, alternative one, these are, because so many transfers are required, the ridership is not high. This is roughly 36 riders per day use this service. And it's skinny lines connecting these stations. And we've got the detail on all of these metrics for each alternative. As we go through, it's a lot of numbers, and it's actually not that interesting or enlightening to sort of look at these on their own. But after we go through all the alternatives, we will have summary tables that compare, and you can kind of see how these things increase and decrease as we move through the alternatives. This alternative one gets a projected roughly 11,000 riders per year, and for a cost of capital cost of about $2 billion. Most of that is restoring double track and improving the rail infrastructure between Worcester and Springfield, and annual operating and maintenance costs of roughly $27 million. This also gives the square footage impact of the new rail and infrastructure on wetlands, on Article 97 parklands, areas of critical environmental concern, buildings, property, etc. Alternative 2 provides, and the rest of these alternatives provide single-seat ride all the way into Boston. Alternative 2 is service from Springfield to Boston with service to Palmer and Worcester. Again, the connection to west of Springfield to Pittsfield, Lee, and Blandford Service Plaza is via bus with a transfer at Springfield, and double tracking of restoring the double tracking. It's really the same infrastructure improvements as Alternative 1 between Worcester and Springfield. The one-seat ride, the removal of the transfer requirement significantly increases the ridership. The ridership increases by more than 4 times. In particular, the rail connection between Springfield and Boston, Springfield and Worcester, as well as between Worcester and Boston. And again, all of the metrics for Alternative 2, roughly 48,000 annual riders, more than 150 a day. So, more than 4 times as much for roughly the same capital costs, about 1.5 times the operating and maintenance costs, reflecting the need to run trains not just from Springfield to Worcester, but from Springfield all the way into Boston. Alternative 3 provides single-seat rail service all the way from Pittsfield to Boston, with service to Chester, Springfield, Palmer, and Worcester along the way. Similar level of infrastructure improvements, but the infrastructure improvements extend all the way out to Pittsfield. And as a result, the Pittsfield to Boston ridership increases significantly relative to the previous options, and the ridership in general grows. It grows by about 1.5 times compared to Alternative 2, and the capital costs increase by about 1.5 times compared to Alternative 2 as well. Roughly $3.2 billion. Again, this is in 2020 dollars, and annual operating and maintenance costs of about $51.6 million in 2020 dollars. Alternative 4, again, we're staying within, for the most part, within the CSX property, but it moves off of the existing CSX rail line onto a separate dedicated passenger line shown here in the the red, and this enables much better track condition and faster train operation. Higher ridership as a result, significantly higher ridership, but significantly higher cost as well. You can see the train serves all of the intermediate stations, and the ridership circles are a lot bigger. You can see the ridership lines get a lot thicker. The Springfield to Boston line is very thick. Pittsfield to Boston line is significantly thicker. The annual ridership, 117,000, almost 400 riders per day, with capital costs of $4.1 billion and operating and maintenance costs of about $65.7 million. Alternative 5 is only goes as far as Springfield with a bus connection from Pittsfield to Springfield, and this it's a similar approach to Alternative 4 with the new rail alignment that stays principally within the CSX-owned corridor and sort of follows the rail, except in a few key segments where there are very tight turns that really slow the travel speed down, and where there are opportunities to sort of cut the corner, to straighten out those turns and get sort of high bang for the buck realignments and speed improvements. This is an alternative that was trying to sort of push the envelope on what's the fastest service that we could get, sort of the most bang for the buck service that we could get, running kind of an express Springfield, Worcester, Boston service. And it you can see ridership that's actually comparable to Alternative 4 ridership. The ridership actually drops a little bit. It's you get a little bit more at Springfield and Worcester and Boston, but you get a little bit less at Pittsfield and Lee and Blandford at the stations that are only served by the bus connection, and it does not have a station stop in Palmer. It's about $1 billion more expensive than Alternative 4, has lower operating costs because you're not running the trains as far. And then Alternative 6 is the alternative that is really more like real high-speed rail, at least for a lot of the corridor. This is operating as much as possible on a principally elevated alignment that stays mostly along the I-90 corridor, but it needs to venture outside of the I-90 corridor because there are constraints and geometric and physical issues where it needs to kind of go outside of that alignment. But it achieves high-speed rail speeds in many portions of the corridor, up to 150 miles an hour, which requires the use of electric trains. So this entails not just a lot of elevated structure and a lot of infrastructure investment, but also electrification of the line. This gets a lot of ridership. It's more than twice the ridership, almost roughly twice the ridership of alternatives 4 and 5. And you can see, very, very thick lines for the ridership here. Much better travel times. The Boston to Worcester, 44 minutes. Boston to Springfield of an hour 19. Boston to Pittsfield, 2 hours 18 minutes. It comes at a very high cost, however. It's about in 2020 dollars, about a $25 billion project with annual operating costs of $86.1 million, total annual ridership of almost 250,000 riders, or about 820 or so per day. And now we're going to have a few pages of tables that sort of rehash all the metrics that we looked at. We don't have to take a whole lot of time dwelling on these, but we can refer back to these when people have questions. But you can see this first slide shows the frequency in terms of weekday round trips of the alternatives. The first three is 4, 6, 7, 4, and 5 are 9 round trips per day. That's nine trains in each direction. Alternative 6 is 17 trains in each direction, and the corresponding boardings at each of the stations along the way. This is in terms of annual ridership, again going from a low of roughly 11,000 up to a high of nearly 250,000. Same information, but now expressed in terms of daily boardings and a typical weekday daily boarding ranging from 36 to almost 25 times as much, 820. This shows the comparison of the travel times as well as the environmental and community impacts of the alternatives. And the travel times drop significantly over the course of these alternatives, going from what is, in alternative 1, kind of comparable to what's available now with the Lakeshore Limited, and going progressively lower to 2 hours to Boston to Springfield, 3.5 hours to Boston Pittsfield, down 2 hours, hour 45, hour and a half, hour 20 for the Boston to Springfield, and similarly Boston to Pittsfield, 3.5, 3, and all the way down to 2 hours, 18 minutes. The environmental impacts, as you start making more investments, building new rail lines, building sort of an entirely new rail corridor in the I-90 corridor. The environmental impacts and the community impacts on buildings, on grade crossings, those increase, in a corresponding fashion, and the capital costs, the operating costs, also increase correspondingly, as we've sort of discussed for each of the options. We took a look at a couple of different things here too. We looked at sort of the construction cost per rider, not the full capital cost. Full capital cost includes infrastructure construction, but also includes things like vehicle purchases, real estate purchases. It includes costs for professional services, planning, design, and so we looked at the ridership sort of per construction cost, the construction cost per new rider for these different alternatives. It starts higher because the ridership is low, and then it kind of drops down even as the costs increase. The ridership increases faster as you go from alternative 1 to 2 and 3, and then to 4 is kind of the best bang for the buck, and then it creeps up a little bit in 5, and then it really jumps up a lot in 6. Even though the ridership increases a lot with 6, the cost actually increases at a greater rate. We also we wanted to take a look at what is the potential impact of a range of induced demand on sort of bringing those cost per rider rates down. So it's kind of a sensitivity analysis based on a range of induced demand that Laura was speaking to. First of 10% is kind of the higher end of what was projected for NEC Future, and then 35% level of induced demand that's sort of like the higher end of what is seen in Europe with those the experience for those European high-speed rail systems. And the cost per new rider does come down significantly. You're adding 10% or roughly a third additional riders to this, and the cost comes down correspondingly. And we wanted to also put the project and these metrics in a little bit in the context of some other rail projects from the region and from across the country. First, we're going to talk about some intercity rail projects. The first two are just studies, so we're comparing forecasts to forecasts, and then the next 4 are actual completed projects. The studies that we're going to take a look at are the NERI study, the Northern New England Intercity Rail Initiative, as well as the California High-Speed Rail Project. And then for the actual construction, we're going to look at 4 projects from across the country, the Downeaster, the Southeast High-Speed Rail Project, the Chicago to St. Louis rail improvements in the Midwest, and then Pacific Northwest, the Cascades Rail improvements. These are all projects that were funded principally with high-speed intercity passenger rail grants and Tiger grants from the federal government in sort of the 2009 to 2012 timeframe, these corridors are the actual constructed projects are different from the east-west passenger rail project in the sense that they're existing passenger rail corridors. Like there's the Lakeshore Limited service, but it's a very sort of minimal passenger service, whereas these other corridors, for the most part, have sort of robust or had robust existing passenger rail, and the investments that were made were incremental improvements that gained incremental passenger increases, but the before and after was also taken over 10 years from 2005 to 2015 when rail ridership was growing significantly across the country anyway. The first one, NERI. A lot of folks here are probably pretty familiar with NERI. It's a study that MassDOT undertook several years ago, looking at potential for higher speed rail from Boston to New York via Springfield, the old inland route that stopped running after the electrification of the Northeast Corridor, and Boston to Montreal high-speed rail. These corridors overlap on the same Boston to Springfield segment of the corridor that we're looking at for east-west. That study looked at sort of lower standards of design and infrastructure investment than what we have assumed for east-west, with a correspondingly lower capital cost of $550 to $660 million, and that's just again for the Springfield to Boston segment. For that segment, it was forecast to have 107,200 annual riders. California high-speed rail. This is a huge infrastructure project that was initiated in 2008 by state legislation and then affirmed with a ballot initiative. High-speed rail, especially outside of the urban areas, with speeds up to 220 miles an hour. It was eventually phased with a phase one going from San Francisco to LA, Anaheim. Over the sort of the life of the project, the cost projections increased significantly from about $33 billion up to almost $80 billion was the most recent full projection for just for phase one. Ridership forecasts scaled back from like 65 to 96 million annual riders down to 33.1 million annual riders, which is still very high. That's a lot of riders, but those changes to projections led California to sort of scale the project back to the central, more easily implemented segment of the corridor with environmental permitting for the full corridor to continue. And then looking at the actual projects, the Downeaster, which began operations in 2001, and then the high-speed intercity passenger rail and Tiger grants of 121 million helped facilitate. Again, we looked at a 10-year. There would have been some growth in there, we expect anyway. Helped to facilitate a 53% increase in ridership. Southeast from Washington through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and to Atlanta, grants of nearly $1 billion enabled a 90% increase in ridership over those 10 years. Chicago to St. Louis, infrastructure improvements of $1.5 billion facilitated more than 100% increase in ridership. And the Cascades in the Pacific Northwest, connecting Eugene, Portland, Olympia, Seattle, Vancouver, U.S. Investments of not quite $1 billion, $890 million, enabled a 21% increase in ridership. So maybe that ridership was already, kind of maxing itself out, but it made it a better service. Looking at these projects relative to, sort of a sample, a somewhat representative sample of the east-west alternatives. Again, these, for the most part, these projects have a much lower sort of capital cost per new rider cost. But again, these are corridors that had existing significant rail ridership, and they made some of them pretty significant improvements, but it was kind of an incremental improvement, whereas the east-west corridor is really going almost from ground level up. So those costs are going to be significantly higher. And finally, we wanted to take a look at another comparative project a little bit closer to home, South Coast Rail project. And this is probably a project that a lot of folks here are fairly familiar with as well. It is proposed, the phase one implementation will provide commuter rail service, which is different from intercity passenger rail. It's commuter rail service via the Middleborough-Lakeville line to Fall River and New Bedford, and investing in improvements to track, bridges, sidings, other infrastructure, projected anticipated construction cost of $525 million, expected to add roughly 3,200 riders. That's 1,600 in each direction, and a corresponding much lower per passenger construction cost. But again, commuter rail is a very different mode from intercity passenger rail. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ethan.
Thank you, Ned. So, as I said earlier in the meeting, we're here to receive advisory committee and public feedback on the 6 that we just presented. So we showed you everything that we've done. We're here to listen. And we are going to a public meeting next week on Wednesday, and we've put out a lot of announcements on that, and that is to present pretty much everything that we've shown here today to get feedback from the wider public, acknowledging that we do have public here today. And then we're going to come back at the end of the month, that's February 24th, to get more feedback and answer questions on the alternatives. So I want to pause there and say that, so apologies if some feel that they couldn't really keep up because they don't have the presentation. So we are in the process of sending out the presentation to the advisory committee via, it's going to be via a Regina Villa email address, just so we can get it out there very quickly. And so that will be in your inbox, hopefully should be by the end of the meeting. Looks like a thumbs up from Sarah Pritzky. So look for an email from Sarah Pritzky at Regina Villa. Look in your junk, spam, whatever your folder is called that maybe it doesn't recognize. But it's not coming from the typical Gov delivery. So just wanted to let everybody know that that's getting out there. As I said earlier, we understand that sort of the limitations on the modeling, so we're looking for feedback, and we're also open to sensitivity analysis. Ultimately, we're not making any decisions. We're presenting. We want to hear feedback. There are no decisions being made, and we very well may not be able to answer certain questions. So the goal is to take questions. If we can answer them, we will. But often we will probably just say thank you, and we'll come back with answers. And that is for the advisory committee meeting number 4. And again, emailing the presentation, you can digest, have conversations, also come back on February 24th. We do have a bit of a layout here for our final alternatives analysis. We have no expectations of exactly which alternatives that's going to be. We want to hear from everybody here today. The only thing we're committing to is finishing the study right now. And we have an advisory committee meeting number 5 and a public meeting number 3. Those are to be determined. And so with that, these details of the public meeting as well as the advisory committee meeting. And this is just, again, the flow process of our study. And this is one of the final slides. And as part of getting to the 3, there are obviously, from a planning study industry perspective, these are a number of the key, we call them key criteria, but they're obviously significant considerations that play into the decision making. And so we have our corridor infrastructure, whether it's shared in the corridor new rail or a new alignment. Obviously the service characteristics, what stops there are, the frequency. We have our travel time, which obviously plays a major consideration in the service. We showed ridership projections for all of them. There are environmental community impacts listed on all those slides that we can also look into deeper. And then obviously our costs and benefits. We have our capital costs that are on the in the presentation, operating maintenance, and then travel time. Now, last bullet. We want to throw it out there for the advisory committee. Really, what criteria do you feel we should use to narrow it down to the final 3? Again, this is not meant to say we're going to go to a final 3. We just want to hear from the advisory committee what their priorities are or what they feel should be major considerations in the decision making. So with that said, I'd like to open it up to the advisory committee, unless Astrid, would you like to say something?
Yeah, if I could just add a little bit to that. You received or seen a lot of information today. And hopefully you will be able to look at the PowerPoint as emailed to you and spend some of the next couple of weeks mulling over not only what's in it, but what you think should be in it. As Ethan said, we are very open to a conversation about how induced demand should be calculated. We expect to do sensitivity analyses, and we are very interested in hearing from the members of the advisory committee how they believe it is reasonable and appropriate and smart to approach that topic. The next advisory committee meeting we see as really the committee having a conversation, and our role being that of resource and facilitator. So we, as Ethan said, we want to hear what are the priorities, what's most important, what else should we be looking at, what should we be looking at in deeper dive on the three that we go, we spend more time on. So this is not a take-home exam, but we are hoping that we've given you enough information in the deck that you will have at home, with you tonight, to be able to start dealing with that data-driven conversation that we're looking for as an important next step, and as we look to form a pathway going forward. So no immediate exam, but hopefully a conversation in 2 or 3 weeks.
And apologies, I should have introduced, this is Astrid Glynn, MassDOT's Rail and Transit Administrator. Okay.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Governor Baker and MassDOT for hosting this here in the city of Springfield, and for everybody taking the time to come out. I appreciate the efforts on the state level. I know Senator Lesser has been at the forefront of this with the governor and legislature, and on the federal level with Chairman Neal, with Richie. Quick question here on all these options, because obviously we want to make sure that this is realistic, financially feasible, sustainable. We've seen the price tag on it. The federal partnership, I would say, would be a key in this. Am I correct? Because you're talking in the billions of dollars, or how much commitment is the state willing to make if the federal, and hopefully some bipartisanship can come on the federal level with the president and Congress. But it's, you're looking at $3 billion at a low all the way up to $25 billion. So, and I'm hopeful that an infrastructure program comes from the federal level, but we want to get it done, but what's realistic, Astrid, without, I'm playing worst case scenario, without a federal commitment. Hopefully there will be a federal commitment.
Well, you're right that a federal commitment is a big part of making this viable. We're very fortunate in the delegation we have. It's hard to imagine being more fortunate in the delegation we have. South Coast Rail, one of the reasons why we included that data in the slide is it's an illustration of what the state has done without federal funds. So that's simply a reference point. Obviously, everything, the real answer to your question is to be determined, but I think the South Coast Rail is a convenient, is a useful reference point to keep in mind.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all this information. It is an awful lot to digest, but I just had a couple of questions, and very quickly. Has anybody approached CSX about their willingness to share this rail, number one? And number two, on your ridership analysis, it seemed like you're assuming an awful lot of us in Western Mass want to go to Boston to work. Have you done an analysis of people who may live in Worcester or Boston that may want to work out here in Springfield or Berkshire? And if you want to look at my thought, which I said months ago, the criteria that we should use to narrow down the field, anything that has a bus-only option from the Berkshires to Springfield should be eliminated immediately. And it would save a lot of time, it would save a lot of effort, and let's just move on. This is, if we're going to make a generational investment, probably a once in our lifetime investment in transportation throughout the Commonwealth, then make it legitimate for the next 100 years across the Commonwealth. Eliminate anything to do with bus only to Springfield.
Let me answer one of your two questions. I will turn to Laura or Ned or somebody, or Drew on the other one. We have conversations with CSX periodically. we will keep having conversations with CSX periodically.
Okay, I'll handle the third. I think no bus, that would come under our last bullet there. What criteria should we use to narrow down to the final three? Thank you, Representative. And the ridership pairs, I understand, are bidirectional, but we'll let the...
I can say this, or Laura can, but the ridership estimates, the forecasts are bidirectional. They were one-way trips that were bidirectional. And all of the alternative operating or service plans were structured in such a way that one could travel not only from Springfield to Boston, but the opposite direction too. So we tried to organize that in a manner that would test the travel patterns and travel demands in both directions.
Thank you, State Senator Eric Lesser. I want to thank MassDOT and the Baker administration for the study. It's been, a very, very long process, and we appreciate the update. I want to just build off of what Mayor Sarno and Rep. Pignatelli said. I really can't stress enough how important just changing the prism of how you're analyzing ridership is going to be moving forward. Frankly, the entire point of the project and the entire point of the investment is to change the dynamics of how the economy in the state is working. So an assumption, and I know back to one of the first slides, a static assumption, that the commuting patterns are going to stay the same once this project opens, just to me doesn't make sense. I mean, if you had done a similar analysis of that for the interstate highway system, it would never have been built because a lot of the highways were built in places where people weren't living. So I think we need to have a more dynamic understanding of where the ridership will come from and how ridership and commuting patterns would change. The other thing that I think really needs to be emphasized, there's a lot of focus here on the costs and the limitations, and certainly, and I think obviously, we want a robust understanding of what those limitations are going to be, but there needs to be some presentation as well of what the benefits will be. What is the expected business investment? What is the expected job creation? And as Rep. Pignatelli pointed out, on both ends, going in both directions. The other thing I would point out that's completely lacking from the analysis is potential environmental benefits, which are very often very hard to calculate, I understand. But for example, Springfield report came out last year putting Springfield and the Pioneer Valley more broadly as one of the worst locations in the whole country in terms of asthma and air pollution. So what are the benefits of that? And then the final thing I would say is more emphasis and understanding about how this impacts the Eastern Mass economy, I think is very important in addition to the Western Mass economy. What does this do, for example, to help with the housing and congestion issues in the Boston area, not just what it would do to help in Western Mass. So I think it's a good start. There's a lot in here that's certainly very encouraging, but I would really encourage MassDOT as this moves closer to completion to give us a more full sense of where the ridership will be developing and where the economic benefits are going to be coming from.
Yes. We actually, so as part of the next step for the three, there was going to be a deeper dive on the economics as well as the environmental benefits like air quality emissions. So certainly something that was on our radar. It's at times it's a question of where it falls in the resources, meaning focus that kind of work on the 3 versus the 6. So it's as we winnow down, we do deeper dives on certain things and understand completely. And thank you for the comments. Appreciate it.
Hi, State Senator Adam Hines. Maybe picking up on what Eric just said around the perceived downsides and particularly the costs, I think for me, I'm encouraged by what we've just seen in terms of the projected costs. And let me tell you why. We're in a year where we've had $1 billion surplus. I know we can't rely on that for fiscal responsibility moving forward, but it was similar the year before. We have new revenue coming on board, $500 million in 2 years in a row. With additional revenue coming on board. We have a situation where when you look at the MBTA annual budgets, Astrid can correct me here, but $2 billion a year, $1 billion off budget in Massachusetts is going to that infrastructure. So that's annually. And so I think the question for me becomes, as we heard from the mayor and Rep. Pignatelli, this is maybe not even a generational opportunity, but maybe once in 2 generations, and with an impact that would be transformative for the Commonwealth in making sure that we are actually connected and are actually thriving to the extent that we can. And so to me, in that context, and looking at not only our current budgets, but then saying, well, wait a second, if there's a penny on the sales tax going to the metropolitan Boston area, is there a penny or some other creative solution for financing that would impact the entire Commonwealth? And to me, the answer is simple. It's incredibly simple. And so I appreciate that we're taking time to do our due diligence, but if the downside is going to be cost, I would really hesitate for us to kind of, any of us in this room, to look at that too negatively, because there are ways to get there when you're going to be this transformative when it comes to the environment, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to equity and beyond. So sorry, that was more of a statement than a question. But I do echo the part, it's pretty easy to get down to 3 when you talk about a rail study. Let's focus on rail across the Commonwealth. The other benefit that isn't outlined here, by the way, I should mention while I have the microphone, is in Pittsfield, you're now 40 miles from the state capital of New York. And so let's talk about another transformative corridor where we're connecting the state of New York and Massachusetts in that way. That is incredibly significant. That doesn't show up anywhere in the study, and so that needs to be factored in as well. Okay, I did have a question. There was, when we're looking at alternatives, I believe it was 4, which said that you are shifting to a new rail within the existing CSX corridor, whichever option that was. I think it was 4. Did you see that there would have to be complications in the greater Boston area in terms of land takings and the like? I wasn't sure about how that factored into that alternative in particular.
So, and Drew can correct me if I'm wrong, but so it is alternatives 4 and 5, new rail in CSX corridor. Within 128, it still would run on the MBTA tracks. And to one of the earlier slides, the triple tracking is a key component of that being able to come to fruition.
Hi, Representative Sabadosa, First Hampshire. So I had 2 small questions to start, and then I have a comment. So these alternatives are based off how many trains running a day?
There's a variety. Depends on which alternative.
But, so alternative 3, let's take alternative 3. How many trains would be running a day?
3. Drew, correct me if I'm wrong. Is that the 9? 9 round trips.
9 round trips, okay. And for that particular option, you had estimated 72,250 riders. Is that for the first year, or is that an average over a certain number of years? What does that number really mean?
So, I could take a shot at answering this one, but we have our modeling person here, so I'm going to let her answer that question.
So that is assuming not after a full ramp up.
Okay.
What the ridership would be for that alternative.
So maybe after a certain number of years.
What we tried to do was take 2020 costs and 2040 ridership.
Okay.
To reflect a mature system.
Excellent. So again, I represent Northampton, and we have train service in Northampton, thank goodness. We've had the Vermonter for a while, and we now have the Valley Flyer, and we are going to hit those ridership goals. But I just want to point out that for the Vermonter in FY18, from Northampton only, we had 21,619 riders. And because I represent Hampshire County, I was just doing some back-of-the-envelope math, and we have about 5 reps, 3 Hampshire, 2 Franklin. That's about 210,000 people. Hampden County has probably over 500,000. So 600,000, thank you. So I'm just wondering why that figure is so low. If Northampton last year can put 21,000 riders on the Vermonter, which is slow, infrequent, and expensive, and we don't want this service to be any of those things, but if it can put that number on a train, why we think that if we're going to run 6 trains a day across the state connecting the major cities of this Commonwealth, we're only going to see 72,000 riders. I don't understand the modeling.
I'm going to turn to the modeler for that one.
So with that one, we did look at the NERI study because it had that north-south component as well. And a lot of that was connecting onto the Hartford line. The majority of the ridership we were seeing there. So it's really about connecting different markets. Connecting down to New York City is a big one. So that's just the primary driver.
I totally understand that, but this study is connecting to the major cities along the route, and so I would argue that these numbers seem very low based on the behavior that we've already seen from this part of the state.
And that's the type of input that we're looking for.
Yes.
As we try and adjust the fares, the comps. Also, I would encourage people to think about hybrid. You know, if you're mulling over the possibilities, if you like the blouse from A and the skirt from B, don't hesitate to put them together. See what you think of the result. Talk to us about it.
Thank you.
Linda LeDuc from the town of Palmer. I would just like to make sure that we don't forget to focus on the regionality of an intermediate stop between Worcester and Springfield. The study that the town of Palmer had the Center for Economic Development at UMass prepare this summer, which we shared with you, states that there's 40,000 workers within that 21 community Lower Quabbin Valley region. That is the study area. So the demographics, as shown in an earlier slide, showed there to be 4,500 workers in Palmer. And I wanted to make sure that we actually didn't look at just the Palmer workers, but the full region of 40,000, 26,000 of them which travel to Springfield to work, and a combination of 14,000 travel to east, to Worcester, Framingham. So if we could, certainly remember that that is going to increase the ridership numbers considerably and induce demand. I'd also like to make sure that we don't forget to look at the underserved community, those in that Lower Quabbin Valley region that don't have vehicles. The study again shows that there's 3,724 homes within the region that do not have vehicles, and currently that area is severely underserved by public transportation. And I think it would be an injustice if we, looked at future transportation and didn't include our responsibility of serving that community.
Thank you. Just to clarify, so to the station level look, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a catchment area around the stations of 20 miles. So it is, just to be clear, it isn't just the municipality, let's say, that the station stops at. There is a catchment area that's included in the modeling. But for your other comments, thank you. We'll take that into consideration.
Hi, good afternoon. Todd Bailey from Bay State Health. I believe that in healthcare, especially in Western Mass, and the comparative knowledge that's out east. What'd you do, Todd? I don't know. Set the... Oh, okay.
So I don't know if they're still on, but.
Okay, I'll just talk over them. So going back to the comparative knowledge that we have in Boston, the Boston hospitals, that the value of this added commute for folks going back and forth, for our knowledge going east and east coming west, would be invaluable, is what we like to say here. In healthcare, we're always struggling for great doctors and nurses, especially nurses. We have such a shortage of nurses in this country that we would love to have some Boston folks coming our way to help, work through our workforce here and help us quite a bit. And it's just a statement, by the way. But anyways, also one question is that, I would imagine most of these trains are diesel trains, and obviously polluting our air significantly. Is that there's been any thought besides alternative 6 that requires all electric trains? Is there thought going into no matter what alternative we take here, is that going to electric trains instead of fossil?
Understood. I turn to Drew to answer that question in more detail, but sort of at a high level, if anything were to move forward into further planning, environmental permitting, the electrification side could be wrapped into the process. But right now, yes, alternatives 1 through 5 assume diesel train sets, and alternative 6 is electrification, but I turn to our train guru.
You touch base on most of it. When early on in our discussion, we talked about the performance of the equipment. And one of the things that we've kept in mind is a new generation of locomotive that is able to run under diesel or under electric. The design varies by the type of traction system that's available, whether it's DC or third rail, overhead, catenary. It's being used very successfully anymore in the state of New Jersey and in Montreal, the latest generation. And if the electrification comes through, let's say to Worcester, then that type of locomotive could operate, we think, very successfully and take advantage of the installed base of the electrification and then continue on diesel. I'll also note that the latest generation of diesel locomotives are all EPA Tier 4. So even although it is still a combustion engine, its emission rate is much, much lower than historically older models are.
Hello, Darren Gray from Bay State Health. My compliments to Ethan and the consultant team. Really nice start to everything here, or continuation of everything. I want to echo what Ms. LeDuc said about the underserved populations. Now, Ethan, you just mentioned a 20-mile radius, and I definitely encourage extending that. I live in Franklin County, along with my FERCOG colleagues here, and I drive 30-plus miles to work every day in Springfield. You know, it's not that hard to imagine the impacts to the Springfield region. And you look at Franklin County, typically the poorest county in the state. I'm one person who commutes down here every day, and the more jobs down here, the better it's going to be for our underserved communities and our overall populations. I mean, the expression you hear all the time out and about here in Western Mass is, it's an amazing place to live, as long as you can find a job.
Thank you.
Just kind of question with regards to alternative 4 and 5. How much more expensive is alternative 4 if you put the improvements that you had in 5 in, which is the priority realignment outside the existing alignment?
So a hybrid of sorts, is what you're saying.
Kind of
So can you, the skirt and blouse analogy. So the question being, can you clarify with microphone, please, for everyone? Actually, Rick, could you hold on a sec? Microphone, please. Thank you.
On alternative 4, you've got the rail from Pittsfield, obviously, all the way in.
Correct.
But on 5, you don't. So I'm not asking for that. But you've improved the line with priority realignment outside of existing alignment, and it looks like somehow that costs $1 billion more, even though you've dropped the rail off. So my question is, what happens if you put those alignment improvements into alternative 4? What's that cost?
Okay, I don't believe we have that number off the top of our heads, but we can certainly go back and bring that number to you at the next meeting.
And just because of historical curiosity on my part, that, you know, $500 some odd million for South Coast Rail, is that the current estimate for that project?
So to be clear, just to do sort of an apples to apples comparison across projects, that was simply the infrastructural construction cost, the hard cost. So that is not the actual total cost of the project.
Right.
So to be clear, that number is lower than what the number you've heard. But to compare the projects together, it was straight infrastructure cost, no soft costs, no engineering, right away, things like that.
Yeah, because that number, you know, 10 years ago was $4 billion. So
Understood.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, just for apples and apples. Okay.
Exactly, understood. Yeah.
But it is higher. Total South Phase 1 is higher.
Thanks, Ethan. Just for my own clarification, the cost projections that you put up, and then you had like cost per passenger, are those after, like, did you include any revenue projections in those that would offset costs, or is this just strictly upfront costs, capital costs? Are there revenue projections within your modeling?
So there are no revenue projections in that particular equation. That is simply construction cost with ridership.
I see. Okay, so there hasn't been any revenue projections as of yet?
Not in that
Okay.
calculation, and I don't believe we've done the revenue projections yet.
Right, okay. Okay, I just want to say that because obviously that offset cost.
Understood.
Okay, thank you.
Very much so.
Hi, Jonathan Butler with One Berkshire. I actually I have a comment, but it's pertaining to the prompt in the bottom of the screen about criteria, so it's appropriate. I actually want to echo what Representative Pignatelli brought up about equity. I think when we talk about narrowing down to the final three, we have to consider equity. I do want to cite, in the Berkshires, we've lost 40,000 people in the last 2 generations. That was about also the same time that we were kind of divorced from commuter rail activity in the Berkshires. So those were public policy decisions that really had a difficult impact for us out there. And I know other parts of the Pioneer Valley have felt similar stresses. At the same time, throughout the last 2 generations, we've seen public policy decisions that have led to population density issues in eastern Massachusetts. So I think when looking at equity, options included in these 6 proposals that deal with buses, I don't believe are equitable. Options that deal with overly lengthy commute times, whether it's Springfield to Boston or Pittsfield to Boston or any of the stops in between, aren't necessarily equitable. But within these options, there's plenty of solutions presented around both those challenges and other challenges. So I think when coming up with what are the final 3 that we should evaluate, we need to take a deep dive into the options that provide the best equity for all of Western Mass as compared to our peers on the eastern side of the state.
Understood. Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the advisor committee? Rep. Pignatelli?
I promise. On the front page, to the far right, you have the long-term capacity constraints at South Station. I would say that's a problem right now, and that's why I keep saying it's west-east, 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 not east-west. And if you look at the history of the Mass Turnpike, it was actually started in West Stockbridge in Berkshire County and went east. You could make some immediate impacts, and I'm glad Senator Hines mentioned about the Albany market 40 miles away from the Berkshires. I've long envisioned that Albany, Berkshire, Springfield, Worcester, Boston, east-west, west-east. You could see a economic boom just during the construction, much like the Mass Turnpike was over 50 years ago. So that would give ample time for Boston to figure out how to solve that long-term capacity problem, which is there right now. So if at the end of the day we had Berkshire, Springfield, Worcester, that would totally change the economic landscape of the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Thank you. Hearing no other feedback from the advisory committee, we would like to turn it over to any members of the public in attendance. We have the microphone coming around.
Pete Landon, Regional Chamber. Congressman Neal recently announced that he was supporting a $760 billion infrastructure plan referred to earlier. And he said he wanted to use a process called dynamic scoring for evaluating it the same way the recent tax legislation had used dynamic scoring. And my question is, would it make sense to piggyback and get our criteria, as mentioned, aligned with the thinking they have at the federal level, particularly on those issues of movement of housing and jobs, as that could actually he mimics what was said earlier, that it'll be based on behavior for economic development and jobs. So it is a dynamic, maybe that's why they call it dynamic scoring, huh?
I can't commit to that, but we can certainly look into the metrics.
Hi, Andy Hoagland from Williamstown Select Board. We're up in the upper left-hand corner. We're by Vermont, so as far as possible from the State House. Smitty Pignatelli said it very well, so I don't repeat that. But the point is that if your criteria are you meeting the goal of this study? This study was supposed to look at rail service to Pittsfield. And I think it's going to be a rude shock to people in all of Berkshire County that the idea of rail service to Pittsfield means a 45-minute bus ride to someplace else. So I think spending more time on these three bus-oriented alternatives doesn't make any sense at all. I think the concepts about regionalization and coverage and catchment areas, I'm 20 miles or so at least from Pittsfield. And if you are looking at a criteria for servicing communities, you are essentially writing off the entire Berkshire County system. And that's a huge loss. That's very different from what the mission was of this study. And I don't think that DOT should be coming out in a couple months saying that their idea of rail service to Pittsfield or Berkshire County is a bus. So I would say drop the three and focus resources which are limited, focus them on things which are going to be much more beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann Miller from Citizens for Palmer Rail Stop. I just want to thank my town planner here, Linda Leduc, and the representatives from the Pioneer Valley who actually had clearly the same kind of reaction I had, which was I was kind of surprised at the ridership projections, partly because I think in our group we have more people who travel every day from Boston to Boston than you have projected even in high-speed rail. So I think there's a problem there. I think the other problem is that it seems lower even than the NERI study, which after all has very modest improvements. Am I incorrect in that?
So as far as your first questions, yeah, certainly we hear you. So as far as NERI ridership, it was, some of the ridership is lower, but the NERI's service characteristics and station stops, obviously, one-seat ride up to Montreal and down to New Haven, down to New York, and down to Washington. So it was a different modeled service, essentially. So.
Okay, but it projected quite a few more people from, say, my stop in Palmer as an example, but those are people are not, you can assume, are not going to Montreal and New York. Most of them are going to be going to Boston. I'm not saying they wouldn't go to New York, and of course we'd love to go to, I would love to go to Montreal. But separately from that, I'm also curious, and this is perhaps more of a question, why, where you decided to pull those ridership, given that you had the NERI study for both environmental impact, which it did look at after all, and I know you say that hasn't been looked at, but my understanding was NERI did look at it. Given that you had the NERI ridership and the NERI environmental impacts, and also given that the Hartford line had ridership that was, I believe, 25% over its projections, that the Downeaster you would think would have been perhaps a better example, which has always exceeded ridership projections and is quite successful. It does feel as if there was there's this artificially low ridership projection, and I'm just curious what your response to that is. Thank you.
Okay, we'll certainly take all your comments, questions, and we'll go back and when we come back at the end of the month, we'll have more answers.
Sorry, we're going to double team you here from Palmer. I'm Ben Hood from the Town of Palmer Rail Steering Committee, and I just want to commend MassDOT and the project team for actually including Palmer in Alternative 6, because as you may recall back in July, you hadn't done that, thinking that maybe it was not in our downtown, and we appreciate that level of responsiveness, and I think your process has been very good that way. I just want to emphasize something that I think the Berkshire people were talking about, and certainly Linda Leduc and other people from the Pioneer Valley. I think that when you look at the final three, communities served is key for many of us. Obviously, I'm from Palmer, so I want more communities served. Springfield might think, that's not a major stop compared to Springfield. But we're working in this together, and I see that whole connection from the Berkshires to Boston, including the fact that it goes out to Albany, as being key. You want rail infrastructure, you want things to build on, you want this to get better with time, because we've actually taken a number of decades out from having the proper level of transportation in the state, and it's time to get back on track. So that's my broader point. Now my question is, with communities served, when you're looking at something like that UMass study that was done for our town, they were looking at Amherst, which is not just Amherst, the town with a large residential population. and potentially, therefore, you know, a lot of people riding east-west rail as well as north-south and going west, everything, you know, all directions out of the state, you know, across the state. But it also has a huge university in it. And so I think that that's one of the key elements for, say, Palmer. We've always been the stop on the turnpike where you get off and go to Amherst. We see our station as a stop where you would get on a train. You have to get there from Amherst, and there's a way to do that on rail, but we're not saying do that today in the study. We're just saying make that connection. I hope that was taken into consideration, all of those students, all of those people who work at Amherst and connect to Springfield and Palmer and Boston and Worcester and all these places that have UMass in it. And so that's a very important consideration. And I hope that was factored in, and if it wasn't factored in, then I think you're going to look at much higher ridership over time.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'd like to encourage the committee to redouble your focus on alternatives 3 and 4, because it seems, speaking for Team Chester, it seems clear to us that those 2 alternatives would propose the best return on investment for all of the things that those of you who spoke referenced. It's not simply because 3 and 4 include our beautiful Chester Station. It's not because our Chester Station is within 50 feet of the finest track infrastructure in the world. It's not because our station has ample free station side parking. It's because principally our rural community, as other rural communities, has virtually no public transportation. That's really what the need is. That's what we're trying to address. And Senator Eric's comments, to me, can be summed up in one word: transformational. That's what we need to make this. Senator Adams' comments, to me, are summed up in the sense of, let's make the big investment the right investment for the most important resource we have, our people. That's why we need to make the investment. And I just briefly follow up on, Smitty raised the issue of CSX, and if I could ask Ethan or someone, how does the recent agreement between CSX and Virginia, how do you see that impacting what you're proposing?
Yeah, Richard Holzman from Chester. I would. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's probably rank speculation on all our parts, how CSX would react. My response is they were willing to listen to a proposal that in the end was something of mutual interest to CSX and to the Commonwealth of Virginia. And what the terms are and how the specifics work out is probably entirely different from anything you could ever consider here. But the point is that, as I think, Astrid, as you said, you continue to have discussions with them. They will listen. I don't know what their reactions are. But to me, the Virginia agreement is an indication that if the conditions are set right and the terms are agreeable to them, they will listen to it.
Yeah, just quickly, I would add Richard Holzman from Chester team. If you look at the map on 3 and 4, let's say, you look at Pittsfield, Chester, Springfield, and Palmer. Historically, every one of those places have been very significant centers of economic activity. When the turnpike went in, it bypassed Chester, as an example, and it really almost killed the economic situation there. We used to have 5 gas stations in a very vibrant town that for 21 surrounding hill towns, historically and accurately, you had the same number in Palmer. This, I think, was done historically by people that planned it that way, so that if you look from Pittsfield to Chester to Springfield to Palmer, they're all about 25 miles apart. I think if we restore that linkage, and have a plan, even if it's a hybrid between 3 and 4, that's going to make a very significant difference, not only for the economic development of this area, but relieving the incredible population pressures that you have in the east, which I really believe and many others do. It's unsustainable. You cannot keep concentrating that number of people in the eastern part of the state without having a deleterious effect on the entire Commonwealth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. On the ridership, I understand that you use the current ridership to kind of project to the new line west of Worcester. My question for, or my comment for sensitivity analysis would be to look at age cohorts when you're looking at population growth, because I do understand, I'm from Central Mass Regional Planning Commission, that we do see west of Worcester, the population is aging, and east of Worcester might be the age cohort. So I don't know how ridership impacts with age cohorts changing a whole lot. So that might be another thing you might want to look at that might change your ridership forecast.
Thank you for the feedback.
Hello, my name is Tracy Opalinsky. I'm a selectman from the town of Ware, and I am the regional representative for the town of Palmer Rail Group Committee. I'm here today because I really want to bring to your attention the connection for the state for the strategic plan for UMass and Amherst. It's really for access and for growth, and to do that through the Palmer stop would be very ideal, as the NERI study says it's very feasible to reestablish that line from Palmer into Amherst. And there is a partnership that currently exists between Bay State Health and UMass now in regards to their research and development. And research and development is happening in Worcester and in Springfield, and it would be thereby connect all the R&D and the biotech together. It would really help grow that area, and it would allow access to land for people to build homes, because I understand the governor can't sleep at night because of the housing crisis. He said at one of our municipal meetings. So I did just want to make sure you knew that there was a big benefit to the state to connect its higher education flagship in Amherst. Thank you.
Thank you. One more, and then we can wrap up.
David Beers, Hartford, Connecticut. I agree with everybody's comments about the ridership projections being very, very low. The Hartford line has shown a 25% year-over-year growth, and frankly, just as other people said, some of the projections are even lower than the Vermonter, which for everyone's knowledge is a once-a-day service that is very expensive. Sometimes it can get up to, I don't know, $70, $80 if you're trying to get from somewhere in Vermont down to New York City. So I think that the ridership projection model needs to be changed. It needs to include induced demand. I think that is something that's just, like, there's no question that it needs to include that, because you have so much of a difference over a once a day train, the Lakeshore Limited, that is often, I took it once, it was 3 hours late. And it often is that way because most of the rail line is owned by CSX. Who's going to use it again after, they're trying to get to a business meeting in Boston and they're 3 hours late? The meeting's already over by the time you get there. So the ridership projections just need to include induced demand. Also, low projections just are long down the road are just, they're not good. The CT Fast Track bus rapid transit system between Hartford and New Britain in Connecticut has suffered because of low ridership projections. Every single parking lot is filled every day from about 8 in the morning to 5 at night. So that's just and Connecticut doesn't know what to do about it now because they don't have enough land to build more parking, and it's a whole mess. So that needs to be changed. Yeah, I agree with bus service needs to be eliminated. I agree with the comments on equitability. a lot of people can't afford to live in the eastern part of Massachusetts, so they move out to the western part, and it's a real pain to have to commute in, back-to-back, bumper-to-bumper traffic every day, not knowing how long it's going to take you, not knowing how, if you're going to get home before your kid goes to bed. I have a question on the service from Worcester to Boston. Are passing sidings or triple tracking being considered?
When you say, are you referring to any one particular alternative or just in general?
No,
Worcester
just in
to Boston?
general. Because, I'm assuming that the MBTA is going to increase service between Worcester and Boston anyway. So, long distance trains don't want to be kept behind slow commuter trains.
So the triple tracking is assumed for the purpose of analysis. As far as passing sidings, I refer to Drew on that one.
Thanks, Ethan. Just on the triple tracking, our analysis of the 6 alternatives, we'll set aside the alternative 6, is it's necessary during the peak periods. And in the off-peak, it is possible to run types of services that we've talked about. But again, if you automatically black out some of the critical travel times, then you're really not providing the right type of service. So the triple track is an essential component on that. The other alternatives either restore double track between Worcester and Springfield, or with alternatives 4 and 5, added a new track adjacent to the existing tracks. And that had some passing sidings on as well.
Okay. And I also want to make a point for electrification. I think that electrification should be considered outside of alternative 6 with high-speed rail. It doesn't need to be 150 miles an hour. That would be great, but it doesn't need to be that way. And I know the commuter rail system is moving towards electrification, so I would like to see, in a long-term study that we can at least consider connecting with possible electrification, even if it's just Worcester to Boston. Like you mentioned, New Jersey Transit has had good success with dual-mode diesel-electric locomotives, and also considering multiple-unit trains, which use motors distributed throughout the cars, either a diesel or an electric or even a dual-mode multiple-unit would be great to be considered as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
How much time do we have? We have time for more?
Yeah, so we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you. I'm Dave Pierce from Chester. I just wanted to note that recently the state's had some pretty good luck with purchasing rail lines and rehabbing them. The Berkshire line from Pittsfield to Danbury, now getting all welded rail, concrete ties, that's doing well. Of course, the Hartford line beat all expectations, just passing $1 million, 1 million riders, I'm sorry. And I'm just curious if any of these negotiations with CSX had included the purchase of the rest of the line. I know you already own it from Worcester to Boston. It might make things easier, and you could still lease it to CSX. And one little comment about speed out in the West End. We took the Amtrak to the last meeting from Pittsfield to Springfield, and it was right on time, hour and 15 minutes, very comparable with if we had driven, which of course doesn't even include the Pike from Pittsfield. You got to go to Lee to get on the Pike, and so we took 20, but that compares well. And I just wanted to point out that 100 years ago, on jointed rail with steam engines, trains were running at 60 miles an hour, and now the Amtrak's running at 45. So doesn't that give you a little bit of leeway right there without any infrastructure?
I can't speak to the CSX negotiations. I was talking about the CSX. Sorry.
I know what the CSX is like, but was there ever any talk of purchasing?
I can't speak to that. No. Okay, looks like we have one more from the advisory committee. Microphone, please. Sorry.
There's some really robust documents, the community needs assessment documents that are done, I think, every 3 years, county by county, is it? So if those haven't been taken into consideration, I encourage you to please look into those. It goes into demographics, the health of the community, what the highest priority needs are. I think those would inform a lot with this as well.
Thank you. So again, our public meeting is next week on Wednesday, and you'll be hearing from us. You should have the presentation in your inbox now, and thank you for coming.